All right, so today we're going deep on meteorology, specifically for those pilots out there prepping for the JAA-ATPL.
Ah, yes, the JAA-ATPL. A lot to cover there.
We've got this textbook excerpt. Looks like it covers all the big stuff. Pressure, temperature, the
All
works.
essential stuff. Once you're up in the
It's
air, thousands of feet up, it all becomes very real.
exactly.
Hmm.
So let's just dive right in. Okay, let's say you're cruising at 30,000 feet. It's freezing cold outside, of course. But how does that temperature compare to what the ISA model
Right,
predicts?
so that difference, we call it ISE deviation, can be really important for pilots. It all comes down to air density.
Because cold air is denser, right?
Exactly. Colder air is denser. Let's say, for example, the actual temperature is negative 50 degrees Celsius.
Oh, wow.
Now, according to ISA, it should be negative 44.4 degrees. So we get a negative deviation there.
Negative 5.6 degrees.
Right. And what does this matter? Well, that denser air can actually change how your aircraft performs.
So you get more engine power.
Yeah, potentially. More engine power, more lift. But that also means you might need a longer takeoff or landing.
Oh, I see. So it's not just about knowing a number, it's about understanding how the atmosphere might actually behave differently.
Exactly.
Now, the textbook also had this interesting visual. It showed three air columns, one at ISA, one warmer, one colder. And they all start at the same pressure at the surface, but then
Ah, yes. But at higher altitudes, things change.
things get
A
interesting.
warm column of air, it's like a hot air balloon. It expands, it pushes up those pressure levels. Higher than a colder column, denser air stays lower.
So they all start at the same surface pressure, but at higher altitudes, that pressure level is going to be at a different height.
Right, and for every degree Celsius difference from ISA, you can expect that pressure level to shift by about 120 feet.
Wow. So if you get the temperature wrong, your altitude calculations could be off by hundreds of feet.
Potentially, yes.
Okay, I'm starting to see why all this is so important. All right, so moving on. Humidity. This is where things get a little, I don't know.
A little more complicated.
Yeah, a little more unpredictable.
Well, think of humidity as the amount of moisture the air is holding.
Okay, that makes sense.
And there are two types of humidity. Absolute, which is the actual amount of water vapor, and then relative humidity.
Relative humidity is like a percentage, right?
Right. Relative humidity tells you how saturated the air is, how much
Mhm.
moisture it can hold before it starts to...
Condense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that brings us to dew point.
Dew point, right. So that's the temperature where things start getting...
With. When the temperature drops to the dew point, the water vapor in the air starts to condense. That's how you get clouds, fog,
Rain.
yes, all kinds of precipitation. Oh, and here's something interesting. The relationship between temperature and how much moisture air can hold, it's logarithmic.
Logarithmic.
As the temperature increases, the air can hold exponentially more moisture.
So that's why it feels so much more humid in the summer, even if there's the same amount of water vapor in the air.
Right, because the warmer air can hold more moisture before it becomes saturated.
Okay, so we've talked about pressure, temperature, humidity, and how they all interact. What about clouds? I mean, we see them every day, but the source material emphasizes how important they are for situational awareness, especially for pilots.
Oh, absolutely. Clouds are they're like signposts in the sky. They tell you what the atmosphere is doing.
Right. So how do they form?
Well, we talked about rising air, right? As air rises, it cools. And when it cools to the dew point, the water vapor condenses. It forms tiny droplets around microscopic particles in the air. And those droplets, those are what make up a cloud.
So all those different types of clouds, they're all formed by the same basic process.
Essentially, yes. Though the way they form, how high they are, all of that can tell you a lot about the weather.
Right. And speaking of different types of clouds, the textbook talked about those four main families: high clouds, middle clouds, low clouds, and then the ones with vertical development,
Yeah, those can be a bit more dramatic.
especially cumulus and cumulonimbus clouds, right?
You definitely want to be aware of those.
And I have a feeling those are the ones we want to try and avoid, if possible.
Cumulus clouds, those are the puffy white ones.
Mm.
They can actually develop into cumulonimbus clouds, which are thunderheads.
Ah, yes. Thunderstorms, heavy rain, hail.
Strong updrafts, downdrafts.
Not the smoothest ride.
Not at all.
And avoiding those is definitely a top priority for pilots, I'm guessing.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's move on to precipitation. The source material talks about how those tiny cloud droplets grow large enough to fall as rain, snow, or hail. Sounds simple, but I'm sure it's more complicated than it seems.
It is. There are a couple of main theories about how this happens. One is a Bergeron theory, which says that ice crystals grow at the expense of supercooled water droplets.
Super cool.
That means the water droplets are below freezing but haven't actually frozen yet.
Oh, okay.
And then you have the collision coalescence theory, which is where those tiny water droplets collide and merge to form larger drops.
So either way, you need those droplets to get bigger before they can fall.
Exactly. And the type of precipitation that forms, it all depends on the temperature and the conditions within the cloud.
Rain, snow, hail. It's amazing how something as simple as water can take on so many different forms.
It is, isn't it?
The textbook even mentioned hail formation and how it can be dangerous for aircraft.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Especially large hailstones. They can cause serious damage to a plane.
I imagine getting hit by a hailstone the size of a baseball wouldn't be fun.
No, not at all.
So pilots definitely need to pay attention to the potential for hail when they're planning their flights.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's move on to visibility. Seems pretty straightforward. You can see or you can't, right? But I have a feeling there's more to it than that.
Yeah, there are a lot of things that can affect visibility. Fog, mist, precipitation, even things like smoke or haze.
So it's not just about whether it's clear or cloudy, it's about how far you can actually see horizontally.
Right. And the source material dives into some of the different types of fog, like radiation fog, which forms at night when the ground cools.
Okay, and then what about advection fog?
Yes. Advection fog is when warm, moist air moves over a cooler surface.
So it's not just fog, it's what kind of fog, how it forms.
Exactly.
All right, well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here in part one, but next, I want to talk about wind. It's what makes flying possible, but as we all know, it can also make things very difficult.
Absolutely. Wind is constantly changing. It's driven by pressure differences affected by the Earth's rotation.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. We'll dig into all of that in part two.
Wind, yes.
From first officer to captain, master your airline command course. Are you ready to shatter the skies and take your aviation career to the next level? Whether you're just starting out or aiming for your airline command, Captain James is your ultimate co-pilot for success. With over decades of experience in both the Air Force and top airlines, Captain James has flown everything from fast jets and the P-3 to the Boeing and the Airbus, racking up countless hours in the sky. His unmatched insider knowledge and thrilling cockpit stories are packed into his best-selling Professional Airline Pilot series and his Skycall YouTube podcast. Buckle up. It's time to fly high. What you'll get is the Airline Command Prep course. You'll master the technical know-how, the standard operating procedures, and the leadership skills needed to take command of any flight. Next is the Airline Pilot Interview Manual. Nail your interview with insider tips, real-world scenarios, and expert strategies that will make you the top to pick. And finally, aircraft-specific guides that cover 600-plus technical questions for every aircraft. Become a pro on both the Airbus and Boeing. Get ready to impress with your technical knowledge and join Captain James on his Skycall YouTube podcast for exclusive behind the scenes access to the aviation world. From interview hacks to emergency handling, airline operations, and real stories from the flight deck. This is your personal seat in the cockpit. It's time to level up your skills and knowledge with expert insights and answers to your most burning aviation questions. Start your journey now with Captain James's books on Amazon Kindle. The QR code is on the screen and the links are below. This is your first-class ticket to a successful aviation career. Become the pilot you were meant to be, with Captain James by your side.
It's a powerful force, isn't it? Driven by those pressure differences we talked about earlier. You've got air moving from high pressure to low pressure. That's the pressure gradient force.
Okay, and then there's the Earth's rotation, which...
Yes. That throws a bit of a curveball into things. The Coriolis effect. It causes the wind to deflect. To the right in the northern hemisphere, to the left in the southern.
So it's not just a simple straight line from high to low pressure?
Nope. And when the pressure gradient force and the Coriolis force balance each other out, you get something called the geostrophic wind. That's wind that flows parallel to the isobars on a weather chart.
Oh, okay. So those lines on the chart, they're not just showing pressure, they're also...
They can give you an idea of wind direction, yeah.
And there's a geostrophic wind scale.
Right. That scale helps you estimate the wind speed based on how close together those isobars are.
So closer together means stronger winds.
Exactly. Of course, the real world is never quite that simple. You have to factor in things like friction, especially near the surface.
Right, so things get a bit more complicated near the ground. Okay, so we've got this complex wind system driven by pressure and influenced by the Earth's rotation.
Hmm.
How does this all tie into those larger weather patterns that pilots need to know about?
Well, that's where air masses come in. Think of them as these large bodies of air, hundreds or even thousands of miles across. They have relatively uniform temperature and humidity.
So they're like these big chunks of atmosphere with their own personality?
Yeah, I like that. And like people, they come from different places.
Right.
The textbook talks about classifying them based on their source region.
Like continental or maritime.
Right. Continental polar air masses, they form over cold, dry land. Maritime tropical air masses, they form over warm oceans.
So it's not just about the temperature, it's about the moisture content too.
Exactly.
So what happens when these air masses with their different personalities collide?
That's where we get fronts.
Fronts, those are the boundaries between air masses.
And there where a lot of the interesting weather happens.
So picture this. You're flying along, smooth sailing, and then bam, you hit a front. What kind of changes are we talking about here?
Well, there are four main types of fronts. You've got cold fronts, warm fronts, stationary fronts, and occluded fronts.
Okay, let's start with cold fronts. They sound intense.
They can be. A cold front is like it pushes in and forces warm air upwards really quickly. You get those cumulonimbus clouds, the ones we talked about earlier.
The thunderstorm cloud.
Heavy rain, potentially hail, strong winds.
Yeah, definitely not ideal flying conditions. What about warm fronts?
Warm fronts are a bit more gentle. They slide over the colder air more gradually. You might get some widespread cloud cover, maybe some light rain or drizzle, but it's not as dramatic.
So knowing what type of front you're dealing with can give you a good idea of what to expect weather-wise.
Absolutely.
But how do pilots actually get this information in real time? The source material mentions all sorts of reports, forecasts.
Yeah, you've got a whole network of weather information at your fingertips. You've got METARs, which give you a snapshot of the current conditions at a specific airport.
So that's like a weather report for right now?
Right. Then you have TAFs. Those are like forecasts. They tell you what the weather is expected to be over the next few hours.
So you've got what's happening now and what's predicted to happen soon. What about those SIGMETs? Those sound a bit more serious.
SIGMETs are basically warnings. They alert you to significant weather events that could affect your flight. Things like severe turbulence, icing, thunderstorms.
Volcanic ash.
Yes. Even volcanic ash. Anything that could pose a hazard to aviation.
So if you see a SIGMET, you know to pay close attention. And there are Windshear alerts too, right?
Right. Those are specific warnings about sudden changes in wind speed and direction.
And those can be especially dangerous during takeoff and landing, right?
Absolutely.
So pilots have access to all this information. It's like having a personal weather forecaster in the cockpit. But what about those weather maps? The source material also talks about surface charts and upper air charts.
Ah, those are essential tools. Think of them as blueprints of the atmosphere.
Okay, so they're like visual representations of all those weather elements we've been talking about.
Exactly. On a surface chart, you've got your isobars, which show you the pressure patterns and help you visualize the wind flow. You'll also see fronts marked on the chart and all sorts of symbols for different types of weather.
Rain, snow, thunderstorms.
You name it.
It's like learning a whole new language.
It is. And then you have upper air charts, which show you what's happening at higher altitudes. They're important for understanding the jet stream, potential icing conditions.
And things like turbulence, right?
Right. So you've got those text reports like METARs and TAFs, and then you have the visual information from the charts.
And together they give you a more complete picture of the weather situation. It's like piecing together a giant puzzle.
It is a bit like that. And that brings us to climatology, which is the study of long-term weather patterns.
So we're zooming out now, looking at the bigger picture. The textbook talks about those idealized pressure zones, the ITCZ, the subtropical highs, and the polar lows. Those sound like the major players in the global weather system.
They are. The ITCZ, or Intertropical Convergence Zone, is this band of thunderstorms that circles the globe near the equator.
It's where the trade winds from the northern and southern hemispheres meet, right?
Exactly. All that warm, moist air gets forced upwards. That's why you get so much rain in those areas. Then you have the subtropical highs, which are these zones of high pressure located around 30 degrees latitude in both hemispheres.
Those are associated with clear skies and sunny weather.
Right. Generally calm and stable conditions. And then finally you have the polar lows, which develop over the poles, bringing cold and often stormy weather.
So it's like this global dance between high and low pressure, warm and cold air masses, all constantly moving and interacting.
Exactly. And those global wind patterns, the trade winds, the westerlies, the jet streams, they're all part of this big atmospheric circulation system.
Okay, so the trade winds blow towards the ITCZ, the westerlies blow from west to east, and the jet streams.
The jet streams ride along the boundaries between those warm and cold air masses high up in the atmosphere. They can reach speeds of hundreds of miles per hour.
So for pilots, understanding those jet streams can be really important for planning efficient routes.
Absolutely. You can take advantage of those strong tailwinds to save time and fuel.
But you also have to be aware of potential headwinds.
Right. It's all about understanding how those winds can impact your flight.
It's amazing how all these different pieces fit together, from those tiny water droplets in a cloud to those massive jet streams. It really highlights how interconnected the atmosphere is.
It is. And for pilots, understanding these connections is essential for making safe and informed decisions in the air.
You know, this deep dive has really given me a new appreciation for the complexity of the atmosphere. It's not just about knowing what the weather is right now, it's about being able to anticipate how it might change.
I agree. It's about thinking ahead, planning for different scenarios.
And having respect for the power of the atmosphere. It's a force to be reckoned with.
It certainly is.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, from the basics of pressure and temperature to those global wind patterns and climatology. It's been quite a journey.
It has. But before we wrap up, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on.
Before we were talking about how important it is for pilots to be able to anticipate how the weather might change.
Right. Thinking ahead, planning for those different scenarios, it's all part of being a good pilot.
Absolutely. So, what advice would you give to a pilot who is just starting to put all of this knowledge into practice?
I'd say the most important thing is to have respect for the atmosphere. It's a powerful force. It's constantly changing. You can't control it. You can only try to understand it.
So, it's not just about memorizing facts and figures. It's about being able to, I don't know, think critically about the information you have.
Right. Being able to analyze the situation, make decisions based on what you're seeing. Let's say, for example, you're planning a flight from a region that's dominated by that warm, humid, maritime tropical air mass.
The one we talked about earlier.
Exactly. And you're heading towards an area that's under the influence of a cold, dry, continental polar air mass. What kind of challenges might you face?
Well, knowing what we know now, I'd be worried about encountering a front somewhere along the way.
Good. Because that's exactly what you need to be thinking about. A front means a change in wind direction, probably a significant temperature drop, and there's a good chance you could run into some of those.
Cumulonimbus clouds.
Yep, the ones we want to avoid.
So those METARs, TAFs, SIGMETs, all those weather charts, they're not just pieces of paper, they're actually tools that can help you.
Stay safe. They can help you make informed decisions about your flight.
Exactly. This whole deep dive has really highlighted how important meteorology is for pilots.
It's not just a subject you study in school. It's something you use every time you fly.
It's an ongoing process of learning, observing, adapting to whatever the atmosphere throws at you.
That's a great way to put it.
Well, I think we've covered just about everything, from those basic concepts to those large-scale weather patterns.
We even talked about hail.
We did talk about hail, didn't we?
Yeah.
And those powerful jet streams.
Amazing how much there is to learn about the atmosphere.
It is, and I have a feeling we've only just scratched the surface.
Definitely. There's always more to discover.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of meteorology. I hope you learned something new.
Me too. Until next time, fly safe.